The Strait of Hormuz, the 33-mile waterway holding the world hostage. A country with one of the largest oil reserves on Earth is running out of places to store its own oil. Its president is on national television telling citizens to turn off their light bulbs. Its economy is losing $13 billion every single month. And yet, it controls something so geographically powerful that even the United States military cannot simply take it back by force. This is the story of the Strait of Hormuz, a 33-mile strip of water that has become the most consequential piece of geography in 2026. And once you understand why this waterway works the way it does, you will never look at global energy, military power, or geopolitical leverage the same way again. To understand why this matters, you have to start with geography, because geography here is destiny. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran to the north and Oman and the UAE to the south. It is the only maritime exit from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, and at its narrowest point, the actual shipping lanes are just 3 kilometers wide each. 2 corridors, one in, one out, separated by a thin buffer zone. That is the entire margin for the world's most critical energy route. Before the current conflict escalated, roughly 20 million barrels of oil passed through this strait every single day. That is approximately 1/5 of the entire global oil supply moving through a gap narrower than many city highways. And it is not only oil, natural gas, fertilizer, aluminum, sulfur, helium, materials that entire industrial supply chains depend on all funnel through those same narrow lanes. China depends on it. India depends on it. Japan depends on it. For much of Asia, this is not a route. It is a lifeline. What most people miss is that there is no realistic alternative at scale. The pipelines designed to bypass the strait can carry 6 to 9 million barrels a day, less than half of what Hormuz handles on a normal day. So when the strait slows down, the world does not simply reroute. It absorbs a shock. Now here is where things become complicated. The geographical forces that created this bottleneck also created something else entirely, one of the largest concentrations of oil and gas on the planet. The same tectonic collision that formed the Persian Gulf deposited the hydrocarbon reserves beneath it. So you have the world's biggest energy reserves forced through the world's narrowest passage. That is not a coincidence. That is a geopolitical trap 500 million years in the making. When the strait effectively closed in early 2026, oil prices surged past $100 a barrel, up from roughly $70 before the conflict. In the United States, national average gas prices crossed $4 a gallon almost overnight. In Asia, governments shortened working weeks to cut energy consumption. In parts of Europe, fuel rationing began. In Africa, electricity use was restricted. One waterway. Global consequences. Every single time. Why the strait is so easy to close. Here is the strategic reality that surprises most people. Closing the Strait of Hormuz does not require a massive military operation. It requires just enough disruption to make insurance companies walk away. When the conflict escalated in early 2026, insurance companies placed a hold on coverage for ships transiting the Persian Gulf through Hormuz. That single decision, made in boardrooms, not battlefields, was enough to drain the strait of commercial traffic. When a tanker captain cannot get insurance, the ship does not sail. It is that straightforward. Iran did not need to physically block every vessel. What it needed was a sustained drumbeat of uncertainty. Drones, sea mines dropped across shipping lanes, fast attack boats swarming cargo ships, naval threats calibrated precisely to create fear without triggering a full military response. Traffic dropped by more than 90%. But the real story is what Iran did next. It did not simply close the strait. It turned it into a toll booth. Ships were rerouted closer to Iranian territorial waters. Some passed through freely, some did not. Some reportedly paid millions of dollars per transit directly to Tehran. Others gained passage through diplomatic back channels, Chinese linked vessels, Indian tankers, ships from countries that engaged Iran directly. They moved. Ships aligned with Washington did not. This was not chaos. This was selective, strategic control. The strait was not blocked. It was managed, on Iran's terms, The deeper geopolitical reason this works so well comes down to terrain. Iran's northern coastline is mountainous, providing natural cover for missile batteries and hardened bunkers. It controls a string of islands, Qeshm, Larak, Abu Musa, positioned directly over the shipping lanes. In these narrow, shallow, reef-filled waters, the world's most powerful navy cannot maneuver at full capability. Aircraft carriers are too valuable and too large to operate safely inside a 21 nautical mile chokepoint. The strategic advantage comes from geography, forcing even the strongest military power to fight on Iran's terms. You do not need dominance to disrupt a strait, you only need the capacity to make it dangerous. But then something happened that Tehran did not anticipate, and it changed the entire calculation: the US counter-blockade and the UAE wildcard. When initial ceasefire talks collapsed in April 2026, the United States made a move that flipped the strategic dynamic. It launched its own naval blockade on top of Iran's. The U.S. Navy began stopping and boarding vessels suspected of transporting Iranian oil. Arleigh Burke class guided missile destroyers positioned across the strait's entry points. Virginia class attack submarines hunting silently beneath the surface. Marines from the 31st Expeditionary Unit fast, roping onto tankers from helicopters in the Gulf of Oman. The message was explicit: no ship approaches Iran without us permission. The result was severe. Iran's daily oil exports, which stood at 1.85 million barrels in March 2026, crashed to roughly 567,000 barrels within 2 weeks of the U.S. blockade beginning. A 70% collapse in export volume. $13 billion evaporating from Tehran's treasury every single month. Here is where it gets strategically significant. Iran had a plan B for years. The port of Chabahar, located outside the strait on the Gulf of Oman, was Tehran's strategic trump card, developed with Indian investment, connected to China and Russia's trade corridors, positioned as the escape route if Hormuz was ever contested. That exit is now sealed too. More than 20 tankers are jammed and waiting at Chabahar. The U.S. Navy is halting every Iran-linked vessel in the Gulf of Oman. Tehran has no plan C. Then came the move few saw coming. The United Arab Emirates announced it was leaving OPEC, and behind that headline was a specific piece of infrastructure that dismantled Iran's central leverage point, the Habshan, Fujairah pipeline. This 380-kilometer line runs oil directly from Abu Dhabi to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. Since March 2026, exports through Fujairah surged 57%. The line is now moving nearly 1.9 million barrels per day. By exiting OPEC, the UAE can add another million barrels per day to global supply, independent of any production quotas. The real reason behind this is devastating for Iran's strategy. OPEC quotas were keeping global oil prices elevated, which meant even Iranian oil sold through illicit channels still generated meaningful revenue at high prices. With the UAE flooding additional supply through a Hormuz free route, prices face downward pressure. Iran is simultaneously losing export volume and per barrel revenue, both fronts collapsing at once. Before we get to what comes next, and there are 3 very different scenarios for how this ends. If you find this kind of deep strategic analysis useful, subscribe. Most of what drives global events never makes the front page. That is exactly what this channel is here to explain. Iran's internal crisis and the proxy network unraveling. What most people miss is that the Strait of Hormuz is not just about oil. It is about the financial architecture that kept Iran's entire regional power structure functioning. For decades, a significant portion of Iran's oil revenues flowed directly to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That money funded Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq, proxy networks in Syria. This was Tehran's primary instrument of regional influence, a 40-year investment in asymmetric power projection across the Middle East. The blockade severed that artery. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has reportedly reached the point of being unable to pay salaries. In Yemen, Houthi forces are drawing down their final stockpiles of drones. In Iraq, militia groups are pulling back from operations, because no funding is arriving. The proxy war network built over 4 decades is beginning to unravel in weeks. Behind the headlines, Tehran's domestic situation has grown severe. The Iranian rial has lost roughly half its value against the dollar in 2 months. Annual inflation has surpassed 40%. Bread lines are lengthening. Medicine prices have risen nearly 60%. The government has shifted to half-day operating schedules. Street lighting in major cities has been cut by half. The Tehran metro has reportedly reduced heating. In April 2026, Iran's Supreme National Security Council convened an emergency session. The assessment that leaked from that meeting read, in the words of analysts, like a document of surrender. 3 conclusions. Protests could erupt within days. The regime can withstand the blockade for at most 6 to 8 weeks. And by the end of spring, nearly 2 million private sector jobs could be lost. Security officials summarized it in one sentence: unrest is inevitable. Only its timing is uncertain. The regime's own security apparatus is acknowledging on paper that it may lose the streets within weeks. Few people talk about this factor, but it is arguably more strategically significant than anything happening at sea. This is not external military pressure from Washington. This is internal collapse from within. Iran, a country sitting on some of the world's largest proven oil reserves, is now using decommissioned, rusting ships as floating storage, because every export route is sealed. A petroleum-producing nation with its citizens beginning to queue for gasoline. That is a geopolitical paradox almost without precedent in modern history. Possible outcomes. The 3 scenarios. So where does this go from here? The real battle is not happening on the battlefield. It is happening in the intersection between economic survival, domestic political control, and nuclear negotiation. There are 3 realistic scenarios. In the first scenario, Tehran decides the cost of resistance has exceeded the cost of concession. It brings its nuclear program to the table, accepts comprehensive International Atomic Energy Agency inspections, and reaches a deal in exchange for the blockade being lifted. On paper, this is the cleanest outcome. But it is also politically explosive inside Iran. The Revolutionary Guards have framed the entire post-1979 identity of the regime around resistance to American pressure. Accepting this deal could be read internally as institutional surrender, and potentially destabilize the very power structure that would be signing it. In the second scenario, the regime chooses to hold on, betting that U.S. domestic politics, midterm elections, rising gas prices, public fatigue, will force Washington to negotiate on less demanding terms. The risk here is severe. As the blockade extends, internal unrest escalates. The regime may survive the external pressure, but lose control of its own streets. A harsh crackdown becomes inevitable, deepening international isolation, and accelerating the economic collapse. In the third scenario, the United States escalates militarily, striking nuclear infrastructure and Revolutionary Guard installations directly. This carries the most severe consequences for Iran in the short term. But it also carries unpredictable regional chain reactions. Iranian retaliation through proxies, potential missile strikes on Gulf state energy infrastructure, and a broader regional war neither side can fully control. None of these scenarios is clean. None is certain, and that ambiguity is precisely why the Strait of Hormuz remains the hinge point of the entire conflict. There is a deeper geopolitical lesson buried in all of this. The Strait of Hormuz did not become a weapon because Iran is militarily stronger than the United States. It became a weapon because Iran understood something about geography and economics that pure military thinking misses. You do not need to win a war to impose a cost. You only need to make something uncertain enough, dangerous enough, expensive enough, that the other side starts calculating whether the goal is worth the price. This is where things become complicated for Washington. The original objectives of the military campaign, restricting Iran's nuclear program, dismantling the proxy network, are now tangled with a new problem the US did not create but cannot ignore. A global economy that is bleeding from a choke point. It cannot easily reopen. The deeper geopolitical reason Iran has held on this long is not military strength. It is that closing the strait costs Iran less than it costs the world. And the world's pain eventually becomes Washington's political problem. But the blockade has changed that calculus. Iran is now paying a price unprecedented since the 1979 revolution. The question is no longer whether Iran can withstand pressure. The question is whether the regime's institutional survival instinct is stronger than its ideological resistance identity. What began as a military campaign to weaken Iran may have revealed something far more consequential than battlefield outcomes. It revealed that the most powerful weapon in 21st century geopolitics is not a missile. It is the ability to threaten the economic infrastructure the entire world depends on. And whoever controls that leverage, controls the negotiation. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway, it is a mirror, and right now, it is reflecting the limits of military power, the fragility of global supply chains, and the brutal logic of strategic pressure applied to a chokepoint where geography refuses to be neutral. Now I want to hear from you. Which of those three scenarios do you think is most likely? Does Iran negotiate, hold the line, or does this escalate further? Drop your analysis in the comments. Some of the most interesting perspectives on this channel come from people watching this from inside the region. And if you want to understand the military mechanics behind how the US is actually enforcing the blockade, the destroyers, the robotic minesweepers, the submarine warfare, and exactly how Iran fights back with fast attack swarm boats, that is the next video. The hardware behind this standoff is as strategically revealing as the politics. Do not miss it.